also here to talk a little bit about her career path and everything that's gone into that. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jenna.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I will rely on all of you telling me that I have successfully started the program.
Looks good.
Awesome. Well, it's absolutely a pleasure to be here. As I mentioned, I have had the pleasure of being at Cal Poly, but it's been a while. So I hope to get back there in person soon. I wanted to start with, there's a handful of slides I'm going to go actually pretty quickly through on EERI, but I wanted you to know, and this has been a big part of my career, is the networking and the communication and the education that you get from selected professional organizations really can be so valuable to your career. So first and foremost, I want to say my name is Janelle Maffei, and it's a tough one, so I never worry about mispronunciation, but it's Janelle. So I did spend a year at Cal Poly Pomona and then transferred to Cal, and I'll give you a little bit about my history in the future. I am a structural engineer and now the Chief Mitigation Officer at the California Earthquake Authority, but I've been involved with EERI for a long time, and I really enjoy these opportunities to speak with students and to speak at universities, to share information about EERI and then my pathway in my career. So EERI, one of the most important things about it is its multidisciplinary nature, because it really gives you the big picture. And their mission is very simple. It's to advance science, to advance the science and practice of earthquake engineering, and then to improve the understanding and to advocate the understanding and the implementation of that practice and science. So why EERI? I'm sure you've already found in college that there are a lot of organizations that you can join, and particularly as a structural engineer, you get a lot of push to go into the technical ones, the plywood, steel, concrete, masonry, or code design. This one, I became enamored with the earthquake engineering profession, and earthquake EERI is the place to be. Connection, learning, leading, and networking is kind of a buzzword, but the idea is that the big picture is so important, and that those connections have served me so well, and I hope I can represent that to you as we go along. I started with EERI when I joined Degenkolb Engineers in, I think, 1990. Chris Poland invited me to go to Big Bear, California after the 1992 Big Bear earthquake. And that had followed the Landers earthquake. There was a series there. And then afterwards, we co-authored a newsletter report. And ironically, they weren't going to put my name on the cover because I was not yet an EERI member. So I put my foot down and joined EERI and said, my name needs to be on that. I can't find a copy, which is so disappointing. But it was a lot of residential construction up in the Big Bear area. There's ski resort, lake. And what we noticed was this zipper effect of hillside stepped foundations, where the shorter, stiff walls essentially took all the load first, kind of fractured, and then it would kind of unzip as it went down the hill. And then, of course, with that movement, of course, there's lots of movement down on the tall, flexible wall. And that was really the start of my interest in earthquake engineering. EERI, multidisciplinary, geoscience engineers, architects, planners, social science researchers, educators, and then government professionals, so that there's a real opportunity to see how science makes its way into policy. The School Earthquake Safety Initiative is so important. We've got a lot of progress we've made in California, but other states, particularly Utah, are looking at students still being in unreinforced masonry. LFE, Learning from Earthquakes, is such an amazing program, and any chance you get to hear a presentation on the group that went and visited and learned from an earthquake, you really should make a point to do that. And then they have this fantastic opportunity, particularly as younger members, to do a LFE travel study program, where after an event you'll go back and you'll look at how the community is progressing after the earthquake. Student membership has tremendous benefits, and there's lots to do after graduation. The Student Leadership Council, Young Members Committee, regional chapters, just an opportunity to step in, wade in, meet people, really educate yourself. And there are regional chapters to get involved in. You can see Northern California, Southern San Diego, Sacramento, and then of course the whole West Coast, and then throughout the United States. Student members get the first year of Young Professional membership free. And of course, always the ERI annual meeting is a fantastic opportunity. I know that you have a student design competition team, and this happened a few weeks ago, but save the date for June of 2022, when it includes the National Earthquake Conference. It's always bigger, and it just lots and lots of tremendous technical and as I said, big picture information. So we'd love to have you find more information, continue to stay with us, and I look forward to now describing what I do. So earthquake risk and resilience, just, hand in hand, risk and resilience. We can define the problem all we want, but if we can't provide solutions, we really are not bringing the value that an organization has the potential to do. So a little bit about me. Born Oakland, California, parents born in Oakland as well. There's lots of growing up and the nurturing that happened between my birth and getting my BA in architecture from UC Berkeley. Always wanted to be an architect since the 4th grade. And then found that I was really interested in the technical part of essentially of construction, and got my MS in civil engineering. I had taken all of the electives required to get into that MS degree. So all of the electives that I had available to me as an architecture major, I took in civil engineering. And then of course graduated and became a consulting engineer. And then onwards to working to get my civil engineering license and my structural engineering license. I should say that in there, my husband and I met at Cal in undergraduate. We did get married, and I believe we got married. Yeah, we got married between master's and civil engineering. It was quite a busy, the 1980s were quite busy. So after I got my civil, we had Ryan, and then there was structural, and then David. And people are always talking about work-life balance. I frankly, I'm starting to hate the term, because where did life ever come out of work, and where did work ever come out of life? I mean, we really should be looking at, meaningful, productive lives. So I wanted to make sure that you knew that, my life has interfered, interacted, provided opportunities to work, and vice versa. So young children, not a very work-life balance friendly profession in the late 80s. So I quit working for a company and created Janelle Maffei Structural Engineer. And then when my kids went back to, started school, the youngest in kindergarten went back to work for Degenkolb Engineers, worked for them for 14 years. And then I said, my husband, Rob Tavani, works for CSI, travels the world, teaching people how to use CSI products. And so I opened up Janelle Maffei Structural Engineering once again. We've traveled to almost 50 countries. But then the chief mitigation officer job flashed across my screen in 2011. And I had to jump at the chance, because it's such an opportunity, and it's where I want to stay and really make a meaningful impact on resilience. So ironically, years and years of consulting engineering, and I will tell you that I do almost as much social science now as I do physical science. Physical science concerned with objects, right? Right brain, left brain, social science, the scientific study of humans. And so it's so important to, when you're thinking about a career, to understand, once again, that interaction between science and meaningful realization of that science in our community is more than just the science. You have to be able to communicate it. And I think if we all look back to our education, very math and science loaded, I think the schools that do the best are the ones that really understand communication skills and how important they are. But this is my joke here about a math class or science class. They were asking how you feel about that. I think the lessons from the pandemic are that for many, many people, science is very difficult to understand, to assimilate. Policy around science, my God, the politicization of it in the last year. And this is all right where we are. Now, it's not a pandemic that's in everyone's face. It's an earthquake that's high consequence, low probability, but it's the same type of interaction. Physical science is being translated into social sciences. What are important to our essentially our constituents, the people that we're serving. And so when you take all these, fancy words, there's a LA reporter that said non-ductile concrete, stop saying that. Brittle concrete, concrete that can collapse. The words that we use don't necessarily translate directly into the words, the emotions, the important things in someone's life. And I made family and financial security very large here. And so that social science is so important. So let me tell you a little bit about the California Earthquake Authority, and that will help describe why we are in the mitigation business. So the CEA is a not-for-profit residential earthquake insurer. We essentially provide a residential earthquake policy for single-family dwellings. And you have to go back to 1984 to understand where we came from. 1984, year the MAC came out, California passed a law that said, if you write a homeowner's insurance policy in California, you must offer that homeowner earthquake insurance. It's separate. It was completely separated from a homeowner's policy, but they mandated that if you sell in California, you must offer earthquake insurance. So almost 30% of the population was insured. Along came the magnitude 6.7 Northridge earthquake, 1994, early in the morning. One of the costliest natural disasters in US history, $40 billion in damage, half of that residential, half of that insured. Insurance companies got their clocks clean. They lost their shirts. They had not collected enough premiums to come anywhere near paying for their obligations. And so they said, we're out of here. With that mandatory offer, you either get rid of that or we're going to stop writing policies in California. Insurance crisis, and of course a mortgage crisis, because so many of federally backed loans, you must have a fire protection policy. So in stepped the legislature to create the California Earthquake Authority. It is an authority, an instrumentality of the state. We are not an agency. Publicly managed, privately financed. You'll recognize some of these guys here. 3 top elected officials serve on our board. They have designees who come to our meetings, and then 2 representatives of the Assembly and Senate. But privately financed, the money comes from participating insurers who actually sell and will service the policy. We write the policy, but they sell it. And then, of course, the premiums from our policyholders. We have a mission to educate, mitigate, and insure. Education is so important. People need to be able to make informed decisions about mitigation and insurance. These are those participating insurers. So, for example, my husband and I have a house in the Oakland area, and State Farm has our homeowners policy. So I went to them. That's who I got my earthquake insurance policy from. It's a CEA policy. In the event of an earthquake, State Farm would adjust the claim. They would send the folks out to look at damage, and a CEA would write me a check if I had sufficient damage. So this way we have an army of adjusters and insurance professionals out there. We didn't have to recreate an insurance company, but we provide that financial security for them that they lost with the Northridge earthquake. So mitigation is funded through the CEA in a very interesting way. This is our financial tower here, and we have just under $20 billion in payout capacity. And it's very important to note that if Northridge happened again, it would be less than our cash value here. And we could pay for 2 Northridges. We could even pay I think the 1906 earthquake would hit us here. You start from the bottom and you go up. So 19.8 billion would finance the damage in very, very serious, I mean, greater than 1906 earthquake or, a series of earthquakes. So financially stable. 6.2 billion in cash, and 5% of the investment that comes from that cash being invested comes into the loss mitigation fund that I manage, 5 million maximum, and it's about 5 million right now a year to fund mitigation. The idea was they wanted us to have a component outwardly facing for the benefit of California homeowners. So not policyholders, but California homeowners. So it's very exciting. That's why I was so drawn to the job, is it's about California earthquakes and resilience. So if you're interested in earthquake insurance at all, you want to play, we have a great estimator on our website. You can choose homeowner, renter, condo, unit owner, mobile homeowner, and then just put in the information. The location obviously is going to determine the hazard. And then of course, information about the structure itself, if you have a house or a mobile home, and information about contents and the like for all of those different kinds of properties, different deductibles, 5% to 25%. And it'll click out the exact premium that the CEA policy would provide. So it's an opportunity to look when people say, hey, it's so expensive, you can go in here and you can play and you can decide for yourself if for your condition or perhaps your parents or someone you know, if in fact it is expensive. Now, there are things to know about earthquake risk, and this gets a little more technical. I love talking to engineers. I can get a little bit more technical. And so what we're doing essentially is we're talking about risk, and risk is defined as hazard, and it's actually times, not plus, but hazard times vulnerability times exposure. We're not doing any calculations in that matter. Rather, we're looking at each of these individually. So exposure in my world is essentially is the population in California. But when I'm dealing with a mitigation program, exposure is one house. So it's the exposure to one individual homeowner, homeowners, family, house, and then of course the impact on the community. Hazard is very simply location. Vulnerability is the structure or the object that we're trying to mitigate. A couple of myths that we're constantly battling. One is, going back to insurance, people think that they are covered for earthquake when they have a fire or home insurance policy. And once again, in California, it is separate. For flood and earthquake peril, you must have a separate policy. And unfortunately, it's so heartbreaking when you meet people after an earthquake who didn't know that. So a separate policy is required. And then this myth that the government will step in and bail you out. So what happens after an earthquake is if it's large enough and the federal government is able, the president issues a declaration, like Katrina, Northridge was, Napa just barely squeaked by to be one, Ridgecrest earthquake. Essentially, then funds will be made available to individuals. Typically, the FEMA grant, that's just a grant, is very, very low and is predominantly meant for emergency health and safety needs and is predominantly an outlay for people who have no means, to try and get them into a shelter, try and get them to be safe. If you have means, for example, you have a house, you're paying a mortgage, you have a job, then you get an SBA loan. It's very low, and now it's actually in competition with regular loans, and it must be repaid. So that's on top of your mortgage if you still have a mortgage. And of course, you're looking for a place to live if the damage is severe. So the idea is, afterwards, maybe Congress comes up with funding like they did for Sandy and Katrina, might be managed by HUD or FEMA, get in line, years to implement, once again, no longer in your house. So the idea here is that resilience is an opportunity to get back the power of resilience and the ability to essentially to manage your own experience after an earthquake. So hazard, we see, go back to that map I had on where they had those three pictures, includes surface faulting, ground shaking, landslide liquefaction, and tectonic deformation. There's different kinds. And then of course, tsunami and seiches. We don't insure the tsunami or, I don't think there's any lakes in California that are, Tahoe could, I guess. The seiche, I don't know how you pronounce that. But faulting, liquefaction, landslide, ground shaking, those are all the kind of damage that we're insuring. And just to do a little earthquake 101 to kind of bring you into my world and how I describe it to lay people, the whole idea of tectonic plates really didn't come to a kind of fruition until the 1960s. And so it really is a 20th century understanding of what's going on. Now, people knew there were earthquake zones. People knew what earthquakes were. Certainly, there were observations of buildings that did well, structures that didn't do well. But really, tectonic, an understanding of tectonics was really about the same time that we took to the sky, and we had the ability to really look back at the Earth and measure the Earth. And we have these maps now that are updated every 3 years in the United States. California actually takes responsibility for updating its own map, in addition to the work that USGS does for the United States. And essentially, these are zones that can be used for the design and analysis of structures for earthquake damage. I'm sorry, I was going to change this to Cal Poly, but I think you'll get the general idea. I was talking to some students in North Carolina. This exists for really any area in the United States that has risk. And it essentially, there is an agency within the state that will map earthquakes, kind of recent earthquakes, past earthquakes, information for their citizens. And the mapping is done not with Richter, because that's just the crazy logarithmic scale, but with modified Mercalli intensity scale, much, much more understandable for all of us, really, because it talks about damage. And if you look at that 7 is really when you start to worry about a structure. You might have some, chimneys will damage at very low levels of earthquakes, but really when you're starting to talk about, significant damage, you're talking about this 7, or we could say kind of this light orange color here. And, so back to Charleston, to the east side of the U.S., magnitude 7.3. Kind of surprising to a lot of people that earthquake of that size. And you can see there's less attenuation that goes on in the East Coast. Older rock, ground motions move differently, and so it's felt quite far away. And so you can see that this 7 was a pretty big area, and particularly for an area where buildings are not designed for seismic. And then, of course, if you zero in on North Carolina, you can even see, more recent earthquakes, 1916. So really, it's surprising to a lot of people, the risk. It's not just California. That Virginia earthquake, there's all these memes, these hilarious memes about the Great Virginia earthquake, but there was in fact some significant damage because, of course, they had very vulnerable, prone structures. Now, moving back to California, we have 2/3 of the nation's earthquake risk. Alaska has more earthquakes, we have more people, and we very, very conveniently place them right in the San Andreas Fault Zone. Something like 85% of Californians live along this band here in the fault zone, and obviously here in Bay Area and Los Angeles. And there's, the likelihood of that Northridge earthquake happening in the next 30 years is almost a near certainty. So what I always tell people is, if you're along the coast, you live in earthquake country. And then, of course, there's some other areas up through the Sierras. And in Northern California, an even larger earthquake, a 76% chance in the next 30 years. And then, of course, that Richter scale, that would be 3 times the energy of the Northridge earthquake. So these are the kinds of hopefully simple terms that we use to try and educate Californians to their risk and what they can do about it. And then, of course, the more interesting thing for engineering, of course, is the longer the fault rupture, essentially the larger the earthquake. And so folks in San Francisco and the Bay Area think that the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake was their earthquake. Hey, my house went through that. And so then I talk about, the 296 miles of rupture that happened in 1906, and the fact that now you take this earthquake that was this big, and it's essentially the Northern California earthquake. So once again, best to just think about, I live in earthquake country. So here's that modified Mercalli intensity. Obviously, there were no seismometers in 1906, but this is what we estimate the ground shaking looked like. And you can see Santa Rosa was hit hard, the whole peninsula, soft soil areas of the East Bay. Compare that to 1989 Loma Prieta, and all the really strong shaking here. What we lost up here in the Bay Area were very poor structures, and particularly poor structures on soft soil, because it amplifies ground motions. And when you put those two next to each other, and this is to scale, look at the impact of the 1906 earthquake. So that's why I think MMI is a much easier translation of ground shaking than this logarithmic Richter scale. And then the importance of understanding just how rapidly the difference between, this magnitude 6.9 and this magnitude, I think 7.8 is what we estimate, in terms of area. And you can imagine the impact in dollar amounts. Now, down in Southern California, the scenario that they say has, unfortunately, a good likelihood of happening is this magnitude 7.9. Locked and loaded is the way they talk about the Southern San Andreas, and you can see it's going to be sending energy right up all the way through the Los Angeles area. And so there are 2, main seismic areas, and of course, it's where we put most of our population. So what do we do about it? So seismic vulnerability, we need to understand just exactly how houses, respond to earthquakes. And there are known vulnerabilities. And I explain this to lay people as with the health analogy is, we know that, women, particularly older women may have these kinds of health risks, older men. We know that there are ethnicities that unfortunately have, kind of genetic vulnerabilities that they may have in terms of health. And so when you're talking to a doctor, they can immediately size you up with some of these kind of known vulnerabilities. Well, we have the same in houses. We understand. And here's the top 4. Cripple wall is a house that has a crawl space underneath the first floor. So it's framed with, either sits directly on the foundation with a crawl space, or it's framed with these short stud walls that are called cripple walls. And for those of you who have worked in the industry, the construction industry is just rife with really un-PC terms, and cripple would be a word that we would not necessarily choose today. It's just less than full height is really what it means. Living space over garage, LSOG, spindly little walls either side of the garage door. And look, this is not, a 1940s house. This is probably 60s or 70s. Hillside house, this is the extreme. This is the pole house. And there were quite a few of them in the Los Angeles area and the Northridge earthquake. 2 of them came down, and unfortunately there were deaths in these houses. And then, as I said, chimneys just come down in low levels of ground shaking. But here's the top 4. And so where do you start? Well, you start with the low-hanging fruit. The nice thing about selecting cripple walls as your first target is we figure there's about 1.2 million of them in areas of high hazard, and you can use age as a proxy, which is fantastic because you can't send a structural engineer around looking at absolutely every house to figure out which ones need to be retrofitted. Here we could identify an age group and target them. So that cripple wall, short stud walls. We've done quite a bit of work of sponsoring research, and let me tell you, this one is very interesting. This was done by peer, by universities throughout California. We had researchers and professionals, and this is what we found. If you retrofit the cripple wall house, this is the kinds of savings that you can have. So we selected this 4 scenarios for 4 locations: San Francisco, San Bernardino, Bakersfield, Northridge. And these magnitudes here are what we call the design-based earthquake. What's kind of a likely earthquake to happen? The scenario earthquake. So let's select San Francisco's magnitude 7.0. They studied 1-story and 2-story wood-sided and stucco-sided houses. And the kinds of savings that we saw were, in the neighborhood of about 60,000 for, let's call it the best performer, which is the stucco-sided 1-story house. And then up in the, $200,000 worth of savings in the retrofitted 2-story wood siding. So that's the worst performing. Now they were using $200 per square foot replacement cost. In San Francisco, it's almost 3 times that much. So a person who retrofits this very vulnerable house, probably historic in San Francisco, starting to save up in the $600,000 mark. And I'm very happy to say I'm going to show you the cost of this retrofit and just exactly what it entails shortly. So really learned quite a bit during this program with peer. And so we have a program to retrofit this cripple wall vulnerability, and we're going to be moving into the retrofit of this living space over garage vulnerability in California. So here's some examples of cripple walls that slide or topple off their foundation. There's those short little cripple walls. Here's the existing. This actually looks like they put plywood on, but boy, you can sure tell it wasn't nailed properly. And it just, topples off, fortunately only about 16 inches here. And here's another house. Now you can imagine you block the front door, sever the gas line. If you have particularly people who have mobility issues, this can be very, very dangerous. And of course, if this cripple wall is 4 feet tall, imagine you and your furniture falling 4 feet. I always say, the house may not kill you, but the furniture is really going to have your number. And then of course, when we're looking at particularly low income, who might be in properties that are not well maintained, they do the worst. You really have to keep wood maintained in order to have capacity. And unfortunately, I met this gentleman who lived here, and he was in a world of hurt. No insurance, no money. I think FEMA was able to help him, but it took years. So what are we doing? We created Earthquake Brace and Bolt. It is a grant program, and we have now retrofitted over 14,000 houses with our grants. We provide up to $3,000, and we're in selected zip codes. We really have a lot of areas in California. And that retrofit, I said I was going to tell you how much, is about $5,200 in California, $5,200. More expensive in Northern than Southern, but now you're looking at those savings and you're comparing that with $5,200. The benefit, the cost benefit analysis is fantastic. And the work is very simple. Here's a crawl space. We go in and we put, these are Simpson foundation plates screwed into the sill, anchored into the concrete, plywood nailed to the cripple wall. 2-day job for a contractor. 1 day if you don't need the plywood, if you have the floor sitting directly on the sill. All done under the house. Nobody marching through your house with little booties. Particularly in COVID, that's fantastic. Just a really simple, basic, very, very beneficial retrofit. And we want to move into living space over garage, as I mentioned. That's our next highest house on our priority list. And so what is this, the living space over garage? Where did that come from? Well, here are the painted ladies in San Francisco. There's a wonderful picture of people standing in the park across from them, watching the fire after the 1906 earthquake. These houses are standing. And you say, well, how could these, these were built certainly in the late 1800s. How could they do that? Well, what they did not have was garage doors in 1906. Those were installed in the 1920s, as well as all of the walls on the first floor taken out for the garage. So essentially, we came in here in the 20s and created soft story houses. And then our codes really, really didn't start to pick up this vulnerability until, I'll say, the late 1980s. And so once again, we can use age, but also there's a really simple visual cue for a homeowner. Do you have a garage on that first floor? Do you have a large garage door? Let's take care of that. We saw examples of damage, 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, and here's examples from 4 of the most recent, San Fernando to Napa. Gets worse when, of course, when you have this mass right above that garage door wall. And you can see these are red tag type of damage, very expensive to fix. But what's that solution? Once again, now the solution is more expensive than $5,000, but it is actually, because most of these garages are exposed studs, most of them have either crawl space or maybe just a couple of rooms in the back. Once again, it's a very, very achievable retrofit. You're going to put OSB or plywood around that first level, and you're going to put some element that has the capacity to provide the strength and the stiffness to keep the house on its foundation. If you have many, many floors, very, very small area, of course, there are, in fact, prescriptive, in this case, a Simpson frame. Hardie makes a frame that you can put around as well. Now, we're excited that Earthquake Brace and Bolt is, with over 14,000 houses, it's time to make sure that it meets the needs of all Californians. And so we're going to be introducing a low-income program. And so these dots represent houses in the Los Angeles area that we have retrofitted with our grant. And it is over an income map. So there's a layer of income, with the warmer colors being very low income and the cooler colors being a little higher income. And so we did not use means testing. We didn't use income as a selection point for how we went to zip codes. And so we have some work to do to meet the needs of low-income homeowners. And so what we'll be doing is we'll be doing more outreach in the zip codes that we're already in. So you can see we're in this area here. So we've got some work to do to bring in these folks. And then we will be adding zip codes to our program to capture areas of low income. And then we'll be providing a supplementary grant to them above that $3,000 that really covers the whole retrofit. So it's very exciting to have the opportunity to provide additional funding to low-income homeowners. We have this grant program. Registration is not open 24/7, and so we created a website called strengthenmyhouse.com that has the information on those 4 vulnerabilities. People in comms wrote it. I didn't write it. And so it's very much in plain English, the idea, a place for people to go to understand how to determine their hazard, their vulnerability, what they should do about it, lists of contractors and engineers, information on how to get the financing, very detailed information, but written once again in language that we believe speaks to the non-technical person. So why do we do this? We have seen once again that this retrofit works. These are two houses that I observed after the Napa earthquake in 2014. That was a magnitude 6 moderate earthquake, almost identical. These two houses, with the exception of this porch, are really the same house, and they used to be the same height. This one came off of its foundation. This was taken a couple of weeks after, when they had already boarded it up. I met the owner of this house the day of the earthquake and kind of accosted him and said, "Had you done some retrofit?" He didn't know what I meant. And I said, like plywood bolts. And he goes, "Oh, yeah, I'd done that under my house." And he had not made the correlation of his work versus what this house did. 2.5 years later, this rental, I think they had 3 rentals in here, not yet reoccupied. This gentleman had damage. He had to pay for damage, but they did not leave their house. It was not red tagged. It was not yellow tagged. They were able to shelter in place, be part of the renaissance of the community. We've seen that it works. We saw that, the costs are reasonable. We're so excited to be able to bring this program, and we're even more excited that we're going to be able to reach low-income homeowners. So with that, let's see how I did. I have some time for questions. I'm so excited. So I will stop sharing my screen, and that was a lot. So I will now, I'm happy to answer questions about anything, about EERI, my career path, and certainly about what I do. I hope that you heard the excitement in my voice. It is my dream job. And my husband and I are at that age where people are constantly asking when we're going to retire. We love what we do. And so we have no plans right now. I want to get that living space over garage. I want to get the low income. And I'd like, frankly, to secure permanent financing from the state and the federal government for this project. So with that, any questions? Everybody's kind of going, that was a lot. And it's not a problem if you don't have questions now. I put my email in the chat, and I love to hear from students, particularly if you have a question about your career. Garrett, I'm going to put you on the spot. Did your mute go off? Oh, Quinn.
Go for it, Garrett.
Okay. I was wondering, you mentioned that last gentleman, it kind of sounded like he retrofitted his own house. Is that something that is kind of something that maybe you guys are pushing for, that some of these retrofits, like especially maybe even the cripple wall retrofit, can be done by homeowners themselves and then later by a structural engineer?
Yes, absolutely. I didn't mention that. And it's an important part of the program, in that we have plan sets that have been approved and building departments have accepted them. Plan set A is used in Northern California, and standard plan set 1 in Southern California. They allow a contractor or a owner builder to do the work without a specific structural design. And these are all voluntary anyway. And so essentially, if you don't go in and make the house worse, you almost can do anything to your house. But it's great because we require for that $3,000 that you absolutely do the work in accordance with the plan set. So it's a code compliant retrofit. The house is not brought up to full code, but it's a code compliant retrofit. They have to have that on the permit, has to have a signed permit, and you can be an owner builder. Because the building departments allow it, we allow it. And we have seen, it's not a huge number, maybe 10% are owner builder. And we actually helped our son do it. You can rent tools. There are tool lending libraries. Our program will allow you to pay for tool rental. We don't pay for any labor for the owner builder. And we very much caution them to be very careful to read the owner builder information that their building department requires, because there was a problem with contractors getting people to hire them as owner builders. And essentially what an owner builder doesn't know is then the contractor takes absolutely no responsibility for their work, after the job or at any time. So my son's house, about 1,200 square feet. He did have cripple walls. So it was both plywood and anchor bolts, was about $1,800 in materials. And we were able to loan him tools. It would have been a little bit more. So clearly an owner builder can do it for less than $3,000.
Nice. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So Quinn, did you have a question? Where'd you go?
Yeah, I guess I mean, you've obviously done a lot with the organization. What do you feel like has had the most significant impact?
So I can almost, I can't tell you the year, but I can remember my husband and I jumping on BART, going to San Francisco and seeing an EERI presentation on damage. And it could have been the 1985 Mexico earthquake. And it was so impactful to me. First and foremost, just the fact that it is not a natural disaster. All of the deaths and injuries come from man-made buildings. It's a human-made disaster. And the fact that we really, with not near certainty by any stretch, but we can solve it, we can fix it. And so just there was a certain level of empowerment in me to know that this was something that could be fixed, something so horrendous. And I remember that distinctly. And then by getting involved with EERI, I can remember being in the room with these just amazing researchers and professionals who at that time were, so much older than I, had so much more experience, and who were willing to share that with me as part of their organization. So when I went to take the CEA job, and it's kind of writing up my application to the firm, and I started writing down the names of people that I could use as a reference. These were some amazing people in our industry that I met through EERI, that I was on a committee with or helped write a paper with. And so that whole being part of a community is what I would say has been the most instrumental to me and the most effective types of networking that I could do.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
I had a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm actually from Northridge, so most of that quite literally hit home.
Yes.
But I had a question. So after a disaster like Northridge, where the damage is so widespread, where do people go? Especially if you have a lot of folks that don't have the funds to upgrade their homes. Are they allowed to stay there? Or?
Right.
Yeah.
So let me use Napa as an experience because it was the most recent. But this Napa is, so if you think about the impacted area in Los Angeles, the city of LA is huge. And then there's these little cities, kind of satellites around it. So city of LA was actually had a pretty good staff, and they immediately got the Structural Engineers Association involved. They immediately passed emergency ordinances about how you fix your chimney, how you evaluate a building. They just had the staff to do that, particularly the legal staff. Little bitty cities were kind of hurting. They couldn't respond as quickly. So let me use Napa as an example. The earthquake happened at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the first people that were able to get out to try and keep people safe were the police, and a lot of them were on bicycles. And so they had, the caution, cuidado tape, and they went around. They would tape off a structure that they felt was unsafe. Now, there were a lot of, guilt by association. There was a house that looked like it actually came down later in the day. Now it doesn't do that, right? It comes down like that, but they don't know that. And so they taped off the house next to it that had no damage. So there's police officers doing that. And then the building department gets, there are volunteers, structural engineers of throughout California have lists. We're ready to step in as volunteers, be deputized and help them tag buildings. I haven't seen a lot of use of that, but so they'll get all of their staff that they can out there trying to tag buildings, but they're doing it with, the worst ones first. And then little by little, LA absolutely utilized the Structural Engineers Association. Forest Service created camps where structural engineers and contractors slept in tents and then went and worked for the city of LA to do the tagging. So if your house is red or yellow tagged and you have to move out, if you have means, you can move in with family. Red Cross comes in, FEMA comes in and sets up shelters. Or people, as I said, they kind of go and live with someone else. People in houses that aren't damaged, though, will even move into tents, though, because it's so frightening to them. I mean, I looked at hundreds of houses after the Northridge earthquake, most of them not damaged so that they were unsafe. I had to convince the people that the crack in the wall was cosmetic. Their house was fine. I was more psychologist than engineer in that case. So the experience of the upper middle class, somebody with means, the experience, you know, like if they have earthquake insurance, now it's about 10% of the population, you can get emergency funds to move your family into a hotel. If you don't have means, you are now sleeping on a cot or in your car at a shelter, and then maybe moving to a FEMA shelter, and then standing in line for services. And so that's, when I talk about that low income program, that's why it's so important to try and be equitable with resilience, because the experience for the person with means and the person without is so different. And structural engineers, as I said, can play a huge part in that, because as part of the SEONC list, you go and volunteer, you can tag, you can bring your expertise after an earthquake. But back to, so Napa then got some tagging. They didn't do a great job. Finally got a little bit better at it. Ridgecrest was scary to me, in that they weren't going to go out and look at a building unless a building owner called and asked for them to come out. And you know what, there wasn't a huge amount of damage actually in Ridgecrest, so maybe that was okay. But it becomes the purview of the local jurisdiction, and their skill level can vary tremendously. Anything else? Well, we're almost done. I wanted to just, if you don't mind if I close with just a little bit more about that work-life balance. I obviously, so I'm 64, now qualify for a shot. You know, you never wanted to be old until the vaccines came out. And so 80s, I graduated graduate school 1980. So there was no such thing as paternity leave when I had my kids. My husband got a phone call at the hospital asking when he was going to be back at work. So I had to make my own work-life balance. That Janelle Maffei structural engineer was the way I did that. And then when I went back to work for Diggin Kolb, I went to work for 24 hours a week and then added as my kids got older. You know, now we are talking about work-life balance for everyone, not just for women, not just for parents. But this whole notion that, as I said, you know, at that time, I felt I was on the mommy track at work and the work track at home. The idea here is for us to, if there's anything we've learned with this pandemic, is you know, that there is no hard line. And I think anybody, you know, I don't know that any of you have children at home. My kids are grown, right? I have employees who are trying to work with, you know, 4- and 5-year-old at home. And then on the other end of the spectrum is someone caring for perhaps a you know, relative, could be an elderly relative. We're in the Structural Engineers Association and in EERI, we are finally looking at ourselves in the mirror and looking at social justice, at equity, at diversity, at work-life balance, and all of the soft skills that should have been there all along. But I'm very proud to say that we're doing that. And I think we all benefit from that. And so if you're interested in what the Structural Engineers Association or EERI are doing about that, particularly the DEI issues, there are opportunities on their website to look at that. So thank you so much. I wish you all the best. I wish you parties and hugs and no masks very soon.
Thank you. We've been doing a silent round of applause over Zoom. Just can't really hear anything, but
oh, I really
thank you for coming.
That. Thank you all. And jmaffei@calquake.com if you think of something that you didn't get a chance to ask.
Awesome.
Great.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Bye.